Okay. All right. Well, hello, everybody. Hope everyone's doing well. Welcome to this month's IGRI research seminar. My name is Uta Brady. I'm a postdoctoral researcher at Arizona State University, and I'm also IGRI's associate director. Before we get started, I wanted to let you know that the call for abstracts for the 2022 IGRI conference is now open. I'm going to be posting the link to the conference in the chat as soon as I'm done introducing our speaker today. But I wanted to let you know that it's going to be taking place online from June 20 to 22 under the theme of advancing the study of institutional dynamics. So we're inviting research presentations that report on the methodological, theoretical, and/or empirical case-specific uses of the institutional grammar to study policy or societal change. Abstracts are due March 1st, and you'll see that on the website. But the one thing that I did want to mention, what's particularly exciting about it this year, is that we have incorporated into the conference design a 3-day in-person workshop for graduate students, and that will take place at the University of Colorado in Denver. So the workshop's designed to facilitate learning of the IG and related methods, as well as to provide students with networking opportunities. We have some scholarships available to support the cost of participation of students. And so if you're a graduate student yourself and you're interested in using the IG, or you're already using the IG, this might be for you. Also, if you have graduate students that you think might be interested in participating, let them know that this is an opportunity for them. The application, so students should be filling out an application deadline. The instructions are on the website, and the application deadline is also March 1st. And that's it, I think, for announcements. Saba, is there anything else? Okay, cool. So today we welcome Dr. Nataliya Stupak as our guest speaker. She holds a PhD in resource economics from Humboldt University in Berlin. She's currently working as a researcher in the climate coordination unit of the Thünen Institute in Braunschweig, which is a federal research institute for rural areas, forestry, and fisheries in Germany. She's an expert in agricultural and environmental policies with a focus on climate adaptation and biodiversity protection. And she'll be presenting her work using the institutional grammar to explore the formation of legal rules in the context of Ukrainian soil protection policies, and perhaps a little bit something else too. So Nataliya, please go ahead.
Thank you, Ute, for the introduction. I'm very happy to be here today in this community. I must say that within the last couple of years, I rather distanced myself from academic research, and I'm now rather involved in policy consultations. So I'm happy again to be in rather more academic community and talk more academic topics and methods. As Uta told, I wrote my PhD and defended my thesis at Humboldt University under the supervision of Professor Hagedorn, and my second supervisor was Daniel Bromley from he's now emeritus professor at Wisconsin University at the US, who is also an institutional economist. And during my time at Humboldt University, I was happy to have a chance to meet and to communicate with Elinor Ostrom. She visited us when she was awarded the Alexander von Humboldt Prize. Yes, now I will try to share my screen. We tested this already, so it should work out. And I will start with my presentation. Okay. Can you see? Good.
Perfect, perfect.
Yeah. So the title of my presentation is The Anatomy of Institutions, and in particular using institutional grammar for diagnosing the formation of legal rules. In my presentation, I will first tell you a little bit about the research focus which I pursue and the theoretical approach which I use. Then I would present in more details how I applied institutional grammar tool in my in several of my projects. And in detail, I will also present you the case study on soil protection in Ukraine. And depending on the time, if there is still some time to go, I could also present you several slides on case study on climate adaptation in Russian agriculture. So it's a related, similar procedure as in terms of methodology, but another setting. So it might be also of interest. So my overall research problem, as for many other researchers in policy science, is understanding and explaining unsatisfactory outcomes of environmental policies. If policies work, they're rather not interesting to researchers, but if the outcomes of policies do not meet our expectations and desired vision, then of course this is the issue to research. Of course, if we are talking about policy objectives, it is seldom that bad objectives are being set. They might be rather broad, they might be rather ambiguous, but it's seldom that they're bad. All environmental policies, environmental laws set the objectives like protecting valuable resources, protecting nature, reducing negative environmental impact, be it greenhouse gas emissions or water pollutions, but there are seldom bad policy objectives. This means, for me, that usually the answer why policy objectives are not achieved or why they are not satisfactory is to look for in policy implementation. So policy implementation became my particular focus. And overarching research question, which I asked in several projects, is which stage of the policy process, in particular policy implementation, is crucial for policy direction and outcomes? And why is this the case? What are the reasons? Does someone not comply with rules, or are the rules formulated in such a way that we cannot logically expect any positive outcomes of policies? And why, if this is the case, why? And how can this turning point in the policy, which influences the policy outcomes, be identified? And what could be the appropriate methods for finding out these turning points? So these are the issues which I've been trying to deal with within my previous research. So if we look at the policy process, we can identify several stages. Firstly comes, of course, the policy formulation, which is being done by legislature. Here, laws are being developed and adopted, which define policy objectives and also desired policy outcomes. After that comes the policy implementation stage, which is often also previously, several decades ago, has been considered as black box and sometimes remains even so. So within policy implementation, we can also distinguish between several stages. The two main ones is, on the one hand, policy specification. Here, the first level executives translate policy objectives into concrete measures and procedures of how these objectives are to be achieved. And they have also, at this stage, the executives have the instrumental objective to control the behavior of, on the one hand, of the policy target group, but also the behavior of the public officials who are responsible for the controlling of rules compliance. And then the second step within policy implementation and the third step within the overall policy process is policy diffusion, I would say, or policy dissemination. Here the rules, legal rules, are being communicated to the policy target group, and public officials, sometimes called street-level bureaucrats, control the compliance with rules. If we look at the policy research in the policy process, I would say that the first stage, policy formulation, is very well researched. There are lots of theories and lots of literature, and also policy diffusion, in particular this theory of street-level bureaucracy and how public officials act and take decisions within their level of discretion. There is also a lot of literature on that. But this middle stage, policy specification, has been up to now paid much less attention. And this is also something I would like to present further when I'm coming to my case studies. So to summarize, policy implementation is a multi-level nested process of shaping and carrying out legal rules. Legal rules are a product, in that way, are a product of a chain of decisions taking at different levels of the policy process. So they are multi-level, and these decisions are embedded in the legal framework laid down at the subordinate policy level. So if we look at here, the decisions which are taken by the first level executives, they are of course embedded within the legal framework laid down by the legislature. The same comes to the public officials. Yeah, the street level bureaucrats, they act within the framework laid down at the subordinate or the superordinate policy levels. These different actors at different levels, they might enjoy different scope of discretion. Yeah, this is also what is interesting. But still, there is this nested features for their behavior and for laying down legal rules. As to the definition of legal rules, I'm using the understanding developed within the classical institutional economics that legal rules are prescriptions regarding what individuals can, must, or may do or not do, which carry the expectation of legal sanction. And this expectation of legal sanction is particularly important for legal rules being affected. So when we are talking about legal rules, we therefore are talking about a situation which is regulated by law. Each legal rule establishes legal correlates. On the one hand, it is the correlate of right and duty, which are assigned rights and duties to members of society. For example, let's take as a basic example, maybe not related to any environmental policy. 10 years ago, approximately, Germany decided to forbid smoking in public places. For example, if we talk about the train station and the platform we are waiting for a train, there were special points created where the smokers can smoke. All other space should be smoke-free. Yeah, in this way, the rights were given by the German government to those people who are non-smokers or want to enjoy smoke-free air. And the duty was given to smoke to refrain from smoking in any place except for the special area. And in order this to be effective, this rule, we need another legal correlate, the correlate of power and liability. This means that there must be some staff personnel, yeah, a person or an official who looks that this rule is being complied with, and at the same time the liability is assigned to the duty holders to comply with the rule. Yeah? And the officials or the staff, in this case of the train station, they have the power to tell the duty holder, the smoker, to refrain from smoking or to go to a special place. In case of non-compliance, a fine might be imposed. So this implies that the situation of right and duty is effective only if it is supported by power and liability. If the latter, this power liability correlate, does not exist or is not believed to operate, then the relation of right and duty disappears altogether and the rule is not effective. This all has, of course, implications for the using and application of the institutional grammar tool. I guess in this community, I don't have to explain the institutional grammar tool. Everyone knows it. I suppose there are 5 elements within the grammar: attribute, deontic, aim, condition, and or else. And depending on the configurations of these elements, different types of institutional statements are being distinguished. So i.e., AIC gives us a strategy, ADIC gives us a norm, and a rule, and a legal rule requires the presence of all 5 elements. However, in their paper, Crawford and Ostrom observe that only these 5 elements are not sufficient for institutional statement being considered a rule. There must be another 2 conditions fulfilled. On the one hand, a controller, an official who controls the compliance, should be appointed, and as a second condition, the control and sanctioning procedure should be laid down. It means if one of these doesn't exist, the rule is not effective. So if controller is not appointed, there is no person who would control compliance. So we don't have this power and liability correlate. This means that we cannot force duty holders in performing their duties, and we cannot protect the rights of the right holders. And if the control and sanctioning procedures are not laid down, then a controller cannot act because he doesn't have the description of his behavior within specific situation. Also, Crawford and Ostrom observed that identifying the elements of the grammar within single statements is not the final objective of the grammar. What is the final objective is analyzing the implications of the statements, the behavioral implications, and also the implications for the policy outcomes. So what does it mean? How did I apply the institutional grammar to my research? There were 5 main steps. Firstly, I will also demonstrate it on concrete examples, but firstly, I determined institutional statements in primary legislation that address or regulate the problem at hand. In my case, I chose the statements for coding that regulated the behavior of the policy target group or the behavior of the public officials. And I refrained from coding, for example, the definitions of terms or the titles of the legislations or single articles, the names. So there were only those statements chosen which regulate the behavior of policy target group and the officials. Further, I looked for further institutional statements within primary and or secondary legislation, which specify the sanctions and apply in case of non-compliance, sanctions that apply in case of non-compliance. Because it is not always given that the complete statement with all 5 elements is written within one legal document. There might be several pieces of legislation which contribute to the complete picture, so to say. Also, I looked for the further documents which appoint controller and those which lay down control and sanctioning procedures, that is to say, which fulfill the additional 2 requirements set by in the paper by Crawford and Ostrom. In the 3rd step, I established institutional configurations. So I linked together using the software, qualitative analysis software, single institutional statements which make one legal rule. So here is a small example. For example, in the primary legislation, in the law on land protection, Ukrainian law on land protection, I found the statement, land users must use land in accordance with land use category. This statement contains 4 elements. In further 2 legislative acts, both are laws, so it's primary legislation, I found the reference to the or else component, the sanctioning in case of non-compliance. There was a statement like, in case of non-compliance with land use, in case of land is not used in accordance with land use category, the fine of, let's say, 30 euros is imposed on land users. Then in a secondary legislation, it is decreed by the Ministry of Agricultural Production and Food. An agricultural inspector was named as a public official controlling the compliance with this rule. And finally, another decree by the same ministry laid down the control and sanctioning procedures. So at the end, when linking all these documents or single statements together, we have a complete and effective legal rules. This means that on part of government, everything was done for rule being effective. And if we do not observe the desired outcomes of this rule, then we have to look at the level of the behavior of street level bureaucracies or the land users. Yeah, then there comes the next step, but at least government did everything they could. In the fourth step, I analyzed the implication of this operational rule. What does this mean, this rule? What does it bring us, and which outcomes can we expect if this rule is complied with? And finally, I looked why particularly this rule has been adopted and not another one, and which rules were made in total effective, and which role do interpretations of primary legislation play in shaping policy outcomes and policy direction, actually. So now I'm coming to my first, I guess it will be the only case study looking at time. It is a case of soil erosion in Ukraine. Soil erosion is the main problem for Ukrainian soils. 58% of Ukraine's territory is affected, and annually around 500 million tons of soil are eroded from arable land. That is to say that these are highly valuable soils, black earth soils with high potential for agricultural production. And loss of soil fertility is observed on 32.5 million hectares. Two laws, Ukrainian laws, the Land Code and the Law on Land Protection, set on the one hand a general goal of protecting soils on Ukraine's agricultural land, and also an explicit policy objective to halt degradation by erosion. However, after 15 years of the primary legislation being in force, no reduction in soil erosion has been observed. So for me, it was a classical case for diagnosing policy implementation. The laws are there, objectives are there, what happens further and at which stage? So I reviewed, according to those 5 steps which I presented in one of the previous slides, I reviewed 42 legislative acts. Of those, 17 of primary and 15 of secondary legislation. By analyzing the primary legislation, I identified 35 statements, institutional statements, with 4 institutional grammar elements, ADIC. These were then taken for further analysis. For 22 of these statements, the or else component was also found in the Code of Administrative Offenses. This means that I had, after the legislation analysis, first step, 22 statements with all 5 elements, institutional grammar elements. Then I proceeded to analyze secondary legislation. A controller has been appointed to control the compliance with 20 of the complete institutional statements. And the procedure of compliance control and sanctioning was laid for 18 of these 20 statements. So the first result of 32 institutional statements selected for the analysis, only 18 fulfilled all the requirements to be considered legal rules. So we don't go into detail. I just wanted to show you, here are 8 statements, but this table was done for all 35 statements with specified legislative acts, either primary legislation or secondary, for all the different requirements for an institutional statement to be considered a legal rule. If we look at the 18 statements which remained, one didn't address agricultural producers, but industry, and regulated the soil contamination with toxic compounds by industrial production. So it didn't, I didn't focus on that statement further, but of other 17 statements, these were actually only 5 statements which were mentioned several times at different places. Yeah, so we have here actually 5 rules, 5 effective rules, which are mentioned several times. And those rules you can see here. First, it's already what we already discussed, compliance with land use in accordance with land use category, then also preventing land and soil contamination, then comply with land management plans containing crop rotation schemes, unlicensed removal of topsoil, and also damage of anti-erosion and hydrotechnical infrastructure and shelter belts. So of these rules, maybe rule 3, where crop rotation schemes are being addressed, and also here rule 5, where shelter belts must be preserved, and or shouldn't be damaged. Only these 2 rules can slightly contribute to combating the problem of soil erosion, agricultural soil erosion. Other rules cannot contribute to solving this problem. So we see that the rules which at the end were made effective by through adoption of legal acts at different levels, they do not address the main problem. And those rules which address explicitly soil erosion, the remedy was cut at the level of policy implementation, at the level of policy specification. There, either a controller wasn't appointed or the procedure of control and sanctioning wasn't specified. So explicitly those rules which could solve the problem were cut. Then I wondered, what if the non-operational statements, full statements, were legal rules? Would that, if the erosion indeed were addressed, would that contribute to solving the problem? So I made another step and analyzed draft secondary legislation, which wasn't, for some reasons, which ones I do not know, wasn't appointed. Though I do know the reasons. I interviewed also the staff from the ministries. So, and my conclusion was that if the non-operational statements were indeed legal rules, if the controlling and sanctioning procedures were at place, and if the controller were appointed, still erosion problem could not be solved because of the interpretation of the problem, understanding of the problem. Within the Ministry of Agricultural Policy and Food, which is in charge of these issues, soil protection is understood as the maintenance and increase of soil fertility. This is not a problem so far because soil fertility may decrease because of different reasons. And in case of Ukraine, because of soil erosion. But the means to achieve the latter were chosen, at least in the draft secondary legislation, incorrectly, because soil fertility was to be increased not by reducing the main problem, that means degradation by erosion, but by increasing fertilizer application and chemical soil treatment, for example, liming of soils with high acidity. So if the currently non-operational institutional statements were legal rules, there would be a high probability that the means chosen to achieve the aim would not address the erosion problem. Of course, within my research, I also asked why, I asked myself, but also my interview partners, why this interpretation persists and where do these beliefs into the means of solving the problem come. And yeah, there was a quite interesting insights into path dependency regarding thinking about natural resources in general and soil fertility in particular, which stem from the Soviet Union times, but I won't go here into detail. And also I was asking why this draft secondary legislation was not adopted. And it seems that at least in Ukraine, but I believe also in many other countries, the lobbying takes place not at the policy formulation stage, where it is more visible and more attention might be paid to, but at the level of the secondary legislation. So the remedy is being cut and the legal rules are not being effective or do not come into being at all. So these results demonstrate that policy making actually extends beyond the policy formulation and continues also to the implementation stage of the policy process. That policy might also gain a change not at the formulation stage or at the level of the public service workers, but at the policy specification level. And there it might be in particular invisible. And also the application of the institutional grammar tool for policy diagnosis and identifying the stage of the policy process with particular influence is a very suitable tool if one pays attention also to these additional requirements for institutional statements being considered a legal rule and looking beyond one legal document, but analyzing the whole set of primary and secondary legislation and linking single statements and establishing these institutional configurations. So that was so far on my first case study. What would you say? Should I also go to the second case study? Would that be interesting, or should we rather switch to the discussion? So the second case study, did I understand that correctly? Okay. So the second case study, another policy, another problem, and another setting. It's also a post-Soviet country, Russian Federation, and one specific province, which is larger than Germany. Just one small province, but it's larger than Germany, for example. So there we have another problem, climate change. Actually, in Russian Federation, climate change is considered something which is very good and very positive for Russian Federation. It is expected that due to increase in the average annual temperature and also the increasing duration of the vegetation period, expansion of agricultural production might be possible. In particular, in my case study in Thünen province, they expect the expansion of agricultural production to the north. However, climate change is also associated not only with these positive expected effects, but also with negative and more short or mid-term effects. That is the increasing risk of unfavorable or extreme weather events. In particular, already now it is observed the increasing risk of drought in those areas of Thünen province where agriculture is currently the main economic activity. So the question here was, how can agriculture best adapt to drought risk, and which role do policies play in promoting or hindering agricultural producers' adaptive behavior? Because of course, on the one hand, adaptation to climate change takes place at the level of single farms, where agricultural producers take daily decisions about what to produce, in which amount, and so on. But on the other hand, there are policies, adaptation at the policy level, where the right incentives might be set for agricultural producers to promote adaptive behavior at the farm level. So I was looking at the role of policies in this particular case. I pursued within, if we talk about methods, two methods. On the one hand, discourse analysis, and on the other hand, the legal analysis, which similar to what I presented for the Ukrainian case. The discourse analysis, I looked at different pieces of news to see how much does drought or this extreme weather events indeed are being highlighted, and if it's perceived as a problem which requires regulation. And indeed, drought has been, several droughts which have been experienced in the Thünen province brought enormously negative results to agricultural producers. Many farms couldn't overcome the damages. It was indeed a huge problem. However, no adaptation again takes place at the level of farms. And I was again looking at the policies, why this is the case, and if the policies might prevent farmers from adapting to climate change. So in the second step, I analyzed the declared objectives within the federal and provincial policies regarding the future of agricultural sector. What is the vision? What do they want for the sector? And I also analyzed again within the secondary legislation which measures were taken in order to achieve the desired development of agricultural sector. Also looking at the budget allocations. So I analyzed in total 48 legal documents for a period of 14 years. Of those, 12 federal laws and bylaws and 28 provincial laws and bylaws, but also 8 annual reports when it comes to budget allocation. So the objective set for Russian agricultural policy is to contribute to providing food to the population and raw materials for industry, as well as to foster sustainable rural development. So it's a very broad objective, which again requires specification. And this chain of translating this objective into concrete steps and concrete policy measures is very interesting. So on the one hand, strong and independent agricultural sector is associated with food security. The food security, however, is defined in a very interesting way. First, it is a self-sufficiency, and it means also, in Russian understanding, self-sufficiency, concrete production targets for different food categories. It is being calculated in a very straightforward way. There were nutrition norms set for people of different ages, population of different ages, for example, how much meat, how much eggs, how much milk products, how much fruits and vegetables should be consumed in 1 year. And this was multiplied by the current population of different age. So in a very straightforward way, the concrete production targets were set for the Russian agricultural sector. At the provincial level, which is only one part of the huge Russian Federation, they go even one step further. They want to achieve 100% self-sufficiency in food production. I don't want to comment it. I asked myself why. Even if you don't want to trade with other countries, you can still trade with other Russian regions. You don't have to be 100% self-sufficient in fruit production if your climate conditions are not suiting this objective, but this is indeed the objective. 100% self-sufficiency in food production just in one small region of the large Russian Federation. And there are, indeed, in order to achieve this, there are concrete agricultural output targets set. How much grain should be produced annually in the province, within the province, how much vegetables, how much, what else, grain I told already, also other crops for which self-sufficiency should be achieved. And in order to achieve this agricultural output targets, agricultural subsidies are being set. Subsidies for crop and animal production pursue this conventional path of increasing agricultural output. And they do not consider this opportunity to stabilize agricultural output by avoiding the damages caused by climate events. Yeah, so the initial reason for decreasing agricultural production, again, is not being considered or not perceived. And in the conditions of heavy reliance on state support, these incentives, these subsidies, they are equal liability. So agricultural producers in Thünen province, they cannot survive without subsidies. So they indeed produce what the state requires. This food production plans, how much each farm, how much of potatoes, grain, legumes, and so on should be produced, it actually limits the ability of each single farm to react to recurrent extreme events, weather events, and to adjust their production. They might have chosen to diversify their production in order to be sure that at least one crop survives the drought or another extreme event. There are also other different options which can be chosen at the farm level, but there is a straight framework which doesn't allow for this farm adaptation. And while agricultural production is regulated by the state, the coping with weather extremes is not. So if a drought comes, the burden of managing the consequences falls on agricultural enterprises and peasant farms. So they are really act in very tense conditions. They cannot adapt on the one hand, and on the other hand, they do not receive support in case of unfavorable weather events. I was asking myself, if and under which conditions can this be changed, and why the situation come into being? And here again, the interpretation at the policy specification level plays a huge role. How do we understand the problems? How do we understand the reason for our problems correctly? And how do we set the measures to solve this problem? This again goes into this black box of policy specification and what happens there, how policy specification shapes the overall direction of policy and its outcomes. And this simple logic which Russian authorities are pursuing does not consider the idea of limiting the losses caused by climate events. I would assume that this logic would persist until it is proved dysfunctional. And this would be the case if agricultural losses due to climate event start to undermine the production targets set at the province level. Which alternative measures will be chosen will of course depend on the precise interpretation of these climate events. Would they be associated with climate change, which are currently they're not? And if there is a sufficient confidence in their future recurrence. And here is, of course, again, the field for the researchers to act and try to provide the decision makers with right and proper beliefs. With that, I guess I would like to finish my presentation and thank you all for your attention. And I'm looking forward to your questions and discussion. Shall I stop sharing the screen?
Yeah, that would be great.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you so much. All right. Any questions for Nataliya? Saba?
Thank you, Nataliya, for your presentation. I think what is really interesting to me about what you're doing is what you started off with, talking about sort of linking different aspects of the policy process through an assessment of policy design. And, you know, kind of what I gathered from hearing you speak about your cases is sort of, you know, we can think about the extent to which policy design is actually accommodating the kinds of outcomes that we want to, that we are interested in. And you sort of at the end of your presentation, you mentioned measures, you know, like what sort of measures, policy design measures could we leverage as a basis for engaging in this kind of assessment, this linkage of policy design and policy outcomes. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that. You know, what sort of measures could we be using that are specifically oriented on the grammar as a basis for understanding the link between policy design and outcomes or potential efficacy of policy?
Well, firstly, I consider grammar a very useful tool for this diagnosis process. This is the first thing. I found it extremely useful, but also a bit complicated of applying when analyzing a huge number of legislative. But it was worth it because I find this, well, if you look at the, first of all, linking to the grammar, it's diagnosis first if all the 5 elements are there. If additional requirements are being fulfilled, and with this you already can see where the problem lies. If I mean, the remedy, or let's say the oils component, is usually in the primary legislation, so then it's the problem of policy formulation. From my experience, it might be different in different countries. I'm not aware how primary and secondary legislation is being designed or laid down in different countries. But firstly, is it a problem at legislation level? If not, we look at policy specification level, if the sanctioning procedures are being set or not, and if control are being identified. So this is the second step in the diagnosis. If not, then that's the problem there. We have to do something at this stage. If at these 2 stages everything was done, then the next step is to look into the behavior of public officials. Do they perform their functions? Do what they want? Do they indeed control, or they are being bribed and they do not control? Do they yeah, I mean, this is also that, but it means that due to this institutional grammar, by applying it, we can look at which stage we have to go into depth and look for reasons and how we shape the policies.
Yeah, that's a really interesting. I like the terminology used as diagnosis, and it facilitates a diagnosis that's then complemented by sort of looking at what's happening in practice.
I guess it's like in medicine, yeah, diagnosis. If a person comes with this specific symptoms, you start to check, you have your checklist and you start checking all the things until you come to the final diagnosis. Yeah, this is indeed diagnosing where the problem is.
Great, thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Anna?
Yes, hi, I'm sorry for not turning on my camera, but right now I experience some Wi-Fi connection problems, so I just want that you can at least hear me properly. So first of all, many thanks for a wonderful presentation, very clear and very, very interesting. And I have maybe more technical questions because I also deal with legal rules and trying to embed them into this institutional analysis and grammar of institutions. So first, I would like to know what is the criterion that you use to distinguish between primary and secondary legislation? So on what basis you did this distinction? And then for me, super interesting was the idea to connect it with the interviews, and what is your theoretical bridge to connect grammar of institutions, institutional grammar with the interviews, and what you do with the information that you collect through the interviews. Thank you.
First, to your first question, primary and secondary legislation, actually primary legislation, there are different definitions, yeah? But for me, in my case, I was looking up primary is the legislation or legal acts adopted by legislature, and secondary, it's the legal acts at the level of first level executives, that mean ministry or equal authorities. Yeah. This is, I guess, the main the difference, or at least in my case, how I distinguished between the 2 groups of legal acts. And coming to your second question, I carried out interviews with the government representatives, that means the representatives of ministries and state offices which regulated the soil-related issues, but I also carried out interviews with public officials and with agricultural producers. It was part of my dissertation, so it was quite a large project. With interviewing representatives of ministries, I was trying to understand their logic. I mean, first also to look why some legal acts are not being adopted, and there I heard several stories about lobbying and in particular intention to cut remedies or avoid controls, specific controls. Or there was also between several ministries, environmental ministry and agricultural ministry, there was a tension regarding the budget allocations. So it is like the agenda control issue. Who is responsible for soil erosion? Is it an environmental problem or agricultural problem? So that was also one of the issues why specific acts were not of secondary legislation were not adopted, because the ministries were blocking each other, so to say. Then with the interviews with public officials and agricultural producers, I wanted to have this feeling if they comply, yeah, both. If both groups of actors comply with, on the one hand, their tasks, if it's about public officials, and with the legal rules, if it's about agricultural producers, if indeed legal rules were in place, could we hope that policy would have desired outcomes? And indeed, they do comply, though in one case of bribery, I identified one case of bribery, but mostly they do comply. And agricultural producers, actually, they do much more for soil protection from erosion on their own initiative, because soil is their main resource, valuable resource. They do more than is required by current policy. Exactly. Did I answer your questions?
Yes, thank you so much. I was just wondering what you do with the information which is fragile, like this identification of bribery and so on, because when you do these kind of research, then you always come at the end to the decision what to do with the knowledge that you gained.
Yeah, that was my large, I would say, moral problem. Yeah? Should I be a researcher and remain distant from such problems, or should I be active and report on such cases? I was also consulting with my colleagues at Humboldt University and with my supervisors, and at the end it was a common decision that I remain a researcher, so I didn't report the case. Yeah, yes, yeah, I have to confess, it was like this, but I spent several weeks thinking about it, and I'm still not sure if it was the right decision on my part.
Angelo?
Yeah, first, thank you for coming today. It was really great presentation. I think, yeah, hopefully quick question and / comment, because your endpoints, and I'm already like, oh gosh, my memory lapsing a little bit, but the endpoints about how people think about and go about like creating legislation, it was making me think about Rob Nixon's concept of like slow violence and whatnot, and environmentalism of the poor, and the idea of how the temporal aspect of environmental like issues, it doesn't really work well with current government systems and ways of going about this. I'm not explaining it well, it's deep critical theory, but like in eco-criticism. But I'm bringing this up in the point of, in all your interviews, I'm curious to hear, if you recall, how did people talk about like these issues of climate change, and specifically the temporal aspect of how it is affecting kind of them, or maybe the lack of recognition of how it affects, again, those who are underprivileged or whatnot, if the right word is.
Yeah. Well, climate is an interesting topic. I was, it was my postdoctoral research in Russian Federation, and I was very close to the government in Thünen province and had a great opportunity to communicate with them quite intensively. And it was interesting that, of course, climate change is officially recognized, yeah, because they're at the official level. But on the personal level, I would say rather not. So all this, on part, I was asking myself, why? Why do not they believe in that? At least, let's say so, climate change is understood as something distant, firstly, as long-term and distant and positive. Yeah, because if you look at those, in particular, the very first maps, world maps with effects of climate change, Russian Federation is always green. So it means we can expect positive effects. And this is something which is a very favorable, very nice belief to have, that Russian Federation will benefit from climate change, that if you observe something which, and a strong belief, if you observe a drought, this is a negative event. It doesn't correlate, it doesn't correspond to this nice vision. First, it's already there, it's not long-term, and it's something negative. So it contradicts this nice vision, nice belief. So they just do not accept it. I mean, they don't see this extreme weather event as part of climate change, because climate change must be something in a distant future and nice, positive. Yeah? So this must be something temporary. This is one thing. And the same, I would say, also on the level of agricultural producers. They also do not accept climate variability, yeah? This phenomenon of climate variability. If you're talking to them, look, there is global warming, you also experience this warming, you have droughts. They say, yeah, but we had also early snow this year. Or the snow was lying on our fields too long, but this is climate variability. Yeah? This is something which they do not recognize as part of climate change. Climate change, at least was communicated often as in very simple terms. Yeah, I would say. Yeah, so we expect global warming. Okay, increase in temperature. We expect longer vegetation period, also positive. But this climate variability, in my perception, it wasn't that good communicated, that one year we can have flood and another year we can have drought. And this is still manifestation of climate change. And this, I guess, was a problem, that it wasn't communicated correctly. I do not know if Russian scientists were, yeah, they were in charge of this, or also the global community, but yeah, this is not internalized, this perception. And also on the farmers level. Farmers also say there is no climate change, or there is no global warming. We had very early snow this year, or very cold summer.
We are out of time, so anybody who has to go, I hope to see you back on March 1st. But I do, if it's all right with you, Nataliya, if you can stick around, yes. Evan has a question.
Yeah, of course. And I will also write my email address in chat, current email address, in case you have questions or want to communicate. So you're welcome to contact me, especially for those who have to leave the seminar.
Thanks, Nataliya. Evan, go ahead. Evan, you're muted.
Thank you. Fascinating presentation, really. Raised a lot of questions I had for kind of the details of how you linked together these institutional statements. You just mentioned, you can think of climate change as drought or flooding or, variation on productivity of agriculture production. And so when you're linking these institutional statements, in your own head, how did you choose to connect certain statements together? And kind of what were the boundaries that you drew?
Well, I mean, practically, you mean? I was using the qualitative analysis, software for qualitative analysis. In Ukrainian case, it was Atlas TI, and then it was MaxQDA. So where you can really establish the links between single documents or the statements. So that was the tool I used, and it was also very practical. But of course, for me, it meant that for each single statements, I was first checking all the fulfillment of all the criteria. So it was a tedious work. I have to admit, it took me, I do not know, several months for those 35 institutional statements, but I would say it was worth it. Of course, you don't always have time if you have only short research projects to carry out, probably that work, but though in team, it works, I guess, even faster. Did I answer it?
Yeah, so I was curious if you kind of came with your own ideas of what you were focusing on and whether those were at odds with the institutional statements or were broader or more complex ideas of, obviously you talk about climate change, your understanding is much more complex than perhaps policymakers, certainly than the farmers. And did you notice, did that have an impact on how you were connecting together policy statements? Say, oh, these two sets were developed with different conceptions, but I see that flooding is connected to drought, and so therefore I'm tying them together as a single.
I mean, those statements related to climate variability were not to find in legislation. Yeah, there you could only find statements regarding what do we want from our agricultural sector and how do we want to achieve that. How important those issues are and if they are at all perceived, I took from this discourse analysis. I analyzed pieces of news for a longer period and looked how they're being presented in the media as something usual or something unusual, and with each next drought it was written, this is the worst drought ever, we didn't have the soil drought, yeah, it's up to 1 meter dry, deep dry. So you could, by those you could see the degree of surprise which was by those who wrote those pieces of news, but also by farmers who gave their assessment of the events also in the news or reports, media reports. So that was something where I just tried to see how important those issues are, if at least from perception of farmers, they call for regulation. Farmers say yes, but they don't know how. They would expect probably this ad hoc state support or something, but of course they want to be protected from the damages caused. Yeah? But at the level of policies, the expectations of what politicians did, this had rather adverse effects. Yeah? So that even their own small adaptation potential at the farm level was cut, so to say.
Thank you so much, Nataliya. Excellent presentation. Thanks everybody for participating. Unless there's any more questions, we are 7 minutes over time. So thank you again. See you on March 1st. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out.
Thank you very much. It was
Bye.
my pleasure. Bye.
Thank you, Nataliya.
Bye.
It was a pleasure to have you.